They laughed when I accepted pennies for my inheritance. They didn't see the trap I had set, a move that would bankrupt them all. This is family betrayal at its worst, and revenge and justice at its finest, where the underdog dropout uses brains, strategy, and foresight to claim a multi-billion-dollar empire. My uncles thought they were stealing from a helpless dropout, never suspecting I was a secret grand master hiding in plain sight. When they signed the papers to seize my grandfather's billions, they didn't realize they had just walked into the most aggressive trap of my entire career. My name is Natalie Edwards. If you follow the world of professional chess, you might know me as the Silent Assassin, a nickname the press gave me because I rarely speak during tournaments, and I never, ever show emotion when I'm crushing an opponent. But to my family, specifically my Uncle Marcus and Uncle Julian, I was just poor Natalie. I was the disappointment, the girl who spent too much time staring at wooden pieces on a board and not enough time worrying about the family legacy. They viewed me as a cautionary tale, a drifter, a girl who barely scraped through high school and refused to go to business school, choosing instead to backpack across Europe playing in chess opens for pocket change. They loved to remind me of this at every Thanksgiving and Christmas. They would sit there in their Italian suits, swirling their expensive scotch, and ask me if I had finally found a real job, or if I was still playing games. What they didn't know, what nobody knew except my grandfather, was that my drifting was a carefully constructed cover. I wasn't just playing chess, I was studying. My grandfather, Arthur Edwards, was the founder of Edwards Global, a conglomerate worth roughly $4 billion. He was a brilliant man, a ruthless businessman, but he had a soft heart for me. He saw through his sons immediately. Marcus was greedy and impulsive, the kind of man who would burn a village to warm his hands. Julian was a snake, a lawyer who loved loopholes more than justice. Grandfather knew that if they got their hands on the company unchecked, they would strip it for parts within a decade. When I was 18, Grandfather sat me down. He placed a chessboard between us. He told me that business wasn't about money, it was about positioning. He told me that if I wanted to save his legacy, I had to become invisible. So we made a deal. Publicly, I was the black sheep. Privately, Grandfather funded my education under a pseudonym. I didn't just play chess in Europe. I attended lectures at the London School of Economics. I took online courses from Wharton under my mother's maiden name. I became a forensic accountant and a master of corporate law, all while maintaining my ranking as one of the top 10 female chess players in the world. I learned to read a balance sheet as easily as I read a chessboard. For 10 years, I played the long game. I let my uncles mock me. I let them think I was financially illiterate. I let them believe I was weak. Then came the inciting incident. My grandfather passed away 3 months ago. It was a massive stroke. Quick, painless, but devastating. The funeral was a grotesque display of hypocrisy. Marcus and Julian stood by the graveside, weeping crocodile tears, checking their watches every 5 minutes. They weren't mourning a father, they were anticipating a payday. I stood at the back, wearing a simple black dress, watching them. In chess, we call this the opening phase. You watch your opponent's development, looking for the strategy they intend to employ. I could see theirs from a mile away. They were aggressive, overconfident, and sloppy. The reading of the will took place a week later in the massive boardroom of Edwards Global. The room was cold, smelling of lemon polish and stale ambition. The family attorney, Mr. Henderson, looked nervous. I suspected my uncles had already gotten to him. I sat at the far end of the table, looking small and overwhelmed. I wore an oversized hoodie and jeans, clutching a chess piece, a black queen in my pocket for comfort. Marcus sat at the head of the table, Julian to his right. They looked like kings holding court. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat and began reading. The will was complex, as expected. But then came the twist my grandfather and I had prepared for, though it had to look like a mistake to them. The will stated that the controlling interest in Edwards Global was to be divided equally between Marcus, Julian, and myself. However, there was a clause, the harmony clause. It stated that if the 3 heirs could not agree on the direction of the company, any one heir could offer to buy out the others, or conversely, be bought out, based on a valuation set by an independent auditor. Marcus smirked. He exchanged a look with Julian. They had expected this. They knew I didn't have the capital to buy a pack of gum, let alone a third of a multi-billion-dollar empire. "Natalie," Marcus said, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Look, we know this is a lot for you to process. You're a chess player, not a businesswoman. You don't want the headache of board meetings, stock reports, and legal battles." Julian chimed in, sliding a thick document across the mahogany table toward me. "We've taken the liberty of drawing up a proposal. We are willing to buy your shares. We'll give you a lump sum of $10 million. You can take it, travel the world, play your little tournaments, and never have to worry about a thing." $10 million? It was a lot of money to the average person, but for a third of Edwards Global, it was an insult. It was pennies on the dollar. The shares were worth at least $800 million. I looked at the paper, feigning confusion. I furrowed my brow and bit my lip. I wanted them to think I was intimidated. "I don't know, Uncle Marcus," I whispered. "Grandfather really wanted me to be part of the company." Marcus sighed, leaning forward, invading my space. "Natalie, be realistic. You barely finished high school. Do you know what EBITDA is? Do you know what a leveraged buyout is? If you stay, the board will eat you alive. We are trying to protect you." I looked down at my hands. I paused for a long time, letting the silence stretch. In chess, time management is a weapon. If you make your opponent wait, they get impatient. They get prone to errors. "Okay," I said softly. "I'll sell." Marcus and Julian practically vibrated with excitement. "But," I added, raising my eyes to meet theirs, "I don't want the cash." They froze. "What do you mean?" Julian asked sharply. "I want the old mill property," I said, "and the logistics subsidiary." They laughed. They actually laughed out loud. The old mill was a derelict factory complex on the edge of town that had been bleeding money for years. The logistics subsidiary, Edwards Transport, was a fleet of aging trucks that was currently operating at a loss due to rising fuel costs and maintenance. "Natalie," Julian said, trying to suppress a grin, "those assets are liabilities. They are worthless." I shrugged. "I have sentimental value attached to the mill. Grandfather used to take me there. And the trucks? I think I can use them to transport chess sets to schools. It's a charity project I want to start." I watched their eyes. They were calculating. If they gave me the trash assets, they could keep the cash and the profitable tech and real estate divisions entirely for themselves. They thought they were robbing me blind. "Fine," Marcus said, waving his hand dismissively. "We will restructure the deal. You sign over your voting rights and your equity in the main holding company. In exchange, we transfer full ownership of the old mill and Edwards Transport to you, plus, let's say, $2 million in cash just to be nice." I pretended to hesitate, then nodded. "Deal." We signed the papers right there. As my pen hit the paper, I felt a rush of adrenaline that I usually only feel when I spot a forced mate in 5 moves. They thought the game was over. They didn't realize I had just played a gambit. A gambit in chess is when you sacrifice material, usually a pawn, sometimes even a piece, to gain a positional advantage. I had just sacrificed a billion-dollar position on paper to gain a positional advantage they couldn't see. Because I knew something they didn't. I knew why Grandfather had held on to the old mill, and I also knew the secret hidden in the corporate charter of Edwards Transport. The old mill wasn't just a derelict factory. 3 years ago, Grandfather had commissioned a geological survey that he never published. I had the only copy. The land sat on top of one of the largest lithium deposits in the state. With the electric vehicle boom, that worthless land was worth more than the entire real estate division Marcus was drooling over. But that was just the icing. The real trap was Edwards Transport. Edwards Global, the main company my uncles now controlled, was a manufacturing giant. They made heavy machinery, but they didn't own their own distribution network. For 40 years, they had relied exclusively on Edwards Transport to move their goods. When Grandfather set up the companies in the 1980s, he included a poison pill in the supply contract between the parent company and the subsidiary.
I had found it during my late-night study sessions of the company archives. The contract stated that Edwards Transport had exclusive rights to all logistics for Edwards Global for 99 years. If Edwards Global tried to use another carrier, they would have to pay a breakage fee equivalent to 50% of their gross revenue. Furthermore, the rates for shipping were set to be adjusted annually based on the discretion of the transport owner. My uncles hadn't read the old contracts. They were too focused on the stock price and the liquid assets. They assumed because they owned the parent company, they could bully the subsidiary. They forgot that I now owned the subsidiary completely. The first 3 months were quiet. I let them enjoy their victory. They bought new yachts. Marcus bought a penthouse in Manhattan. They fired half the loyal staff grandfather had employed for decades and replaced them with sycophants. They were stripping the company of its culture and its cash reserves. Then I made my move. I sent a formal letter to the CEO's office, Marcus's office. It was a notice of rate adjustment. I raised the shipping rates for Edwards Global by 400%. I was sitting in a small cafe in Paris preparing for a tournament when my phone blew up. It was Marcus. "Natalie, what the hell is this?" he screamed. "Hello, Uncle," I said calmly, sipping my espresso. "I assume you received the updated pricing schedule for Edwards Transport? You can't do this. This is extortion. We'll fire you. We'll use FedEx. We'll use anyone else." I politely referred him to Clause 14, Section B of the original 1985 service agreement. I told him to have Julian read it. There was silence on the line, followed by muffled cursing, and then the sound of paper tearing. You little witch," Julian's voice came on the line. "This contract is archaic. We'll fight it in court." "You can try," I said, "but court takes time, and your inventory is sitting on my loading docks. Until you pay the new rates, nothing moves. Not a single generator, not a single engine. Nothing." And I knew their position. They had leveraged the company to the hilt to fund their lavish lifestyles and to buy out some minority shareholders. They needed cash flow immediately to service their debt. If they couldn't ship products, they couldn't invoice clients. If they couldn't invoice, they defaulted on their loans. This is the middle game. This is where you apply pressure. You constrict the opponent's movement until they are in zugzwang, a situation where every move they make only worsens their position.
For 2 weeks, nothing moved. Their stock price began to wobble. Customers were canceling orders. My uncles were bleeding money. They tried to sue. I showed up to the preliminary hearing not in a hoodie but in a tailored navy suit, flanked by a team of lawyers I had hired with the $2 million they gave me. I also brought the geological survey for the old mill and leaked it to the press that morning. The news hit the wire. Chess champion heiress sits on billion-dollar lithium mine while uncle's bankrupt family legacy. The public perception shifted instantly. I wasn't the dumb dropout anymore. I was the savvy savant. Their stock tanked. The board of directors, the ones Marcus had installed, began to panic. My uncles requested an emergency meeting. They wanted to settle. I agreed to meet them. Same boardroom, same table. But the atmosphere was very different this time. Marcus looked 10 years older. His face was gray, his tie loosened. Julian was shaking, shuffling papers that offered no salvation. I walked in. I didn't sit at the far end of the table this time. I walked right up to the head of the table, where Marcus was sitting. I stood over him until he awkwardly stood up and moved to a side chair. I sat in grandfather's seat. "You're ruining us," Marcus rasped. "We're family, Natalie." "Family?" I asked, my voice cold. "You mean the family that mocked me? The family that tried to swindle me out of my inheritance because you thought I was too stupid to read a contract? We can fix this," Julian stammered. "We'll pay the rates. Just lower them a little, please. The banks are calling in the loans." I shook my head. "No, I don't want the rates anymore." "Then what do you want?" Marcus cried. "Checkmate," I said. I slid a binder across the table.
Inside was a tender offer. Since your stock price has dropped 60% in the last month due to your mismanagement and the supply chain crisis, and since you are on the verge of defaulting on your debt, I have purchased the majority of your debt from the banks. Their eyes went wide. They looked at me like I was an alien. How? Julian whispered. You don't have that kind of money. I leveraged the old mill, I explained. The lithium valuation allowed me to secure a line of credit that dwarfs your personal fortunes. I own your debt, uncles, and you are in default. I laid out the terms. It was brutal. It was the kind of deal they would have offered me if the roles were reversed. I would acquire all of their shares in Edwards Global in exchange for forgiving the personal guarantees they had signed on the company loans. They would walk away with nothing. No stock, no company, no golden parachutes. But they wouldn't go to jail for fraud, which was the other option, considering I had found evidence they were cooking the books to hide the losses from the board. You can't leave us with nothing, Marcus wept. I have mortgages. I have expenses. You have a law degree, Julian, I said. And Marcus, you're a businessman. I'm sure you can find entry-level positions somewhere. They signed. They had no choice. Their hands were shaking so hard they could barely hold the pens. As they left the building, carrying cardboard boxes with their personal belongings, security escorted them out. I stood by the window of my grandfather's office, my office now, and watched them get into their cars. I didn't feel joy, exactly. I felt relief. I felt a sense of order restored. I spent the next year cleaning up their mess. I integrated the transport company back into the main fold, correcting the supply chain issues. I developed the lithium mine responsibly, creating thousands of jobs. I reinstated the employees they had fired. I also kept playing chess. In fact, my rating went up. It turns out running a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate is excellent training for high-stakes strategy. Last week, I received a postcard from Uncle Marcus. He's living in a small condo in Florida, working as a consultant for a small logistics firm. He asked for a loan. I didn't reply. I simply looked at the chessboard on my desk. Grandfather always taught me that in chess, you never take your hand off the piece until you're sure of the move. My uncles made their move the day they decided to underestimate me. They took their hands off the piece too early. They saw a dropout. Grandfather saw a grand master. I looked at the black queen sitting on my desk, the most powerful piece on the board, capable of moving in any direction, capable of infinite aggression, but often used to protect the king. I protected the king's legacy, and as for my uncles, they learned the hard way. When you sit down across from a chess player, you better be ready to play until the very end, because we don't just plan for the next move, we plan for the next 10. Checkmate. But the story doesn't quite end there. You see, the dismantling of my uncles was just the public face of the victory. The internal restructuring was where the real beauty lay. I had to audit every single department to find where they had buried the bodies, financially speaking. I found shell companies set up in the Caymans where they were siphoning off R&D budgets. Julian had set up a consulting firm that did nothing but bill Edwards Global for strategic advice at a rate of $50,000 a month. It was sloppy. It was greedy. I called a company-wide meeting about 2 months after the takeover. I stood on the stage in the main auditorium. Thousands of faces looked up at me. Some were scared, wondering if the chess girl knew what she was doing. Some were hopeful. I didn't use a teleprompter. I spoke from the heart. I told them, my grandfather built this company on integrity and innovation. For the last few months, those values were compromised. You were told that profits matter more than people. You were told that the quality of our product was secondary to the stock price. That ends today. I announced that the profits from the lithium mine wouldn't just pad the executive bonuses. I created an employee stock ownership plan. I wanted everyone in that room to have a piece of the success. The applause was deafening. It wasn't the polite applause of a boardroom. It was the roaring applause of people who realized they were safe. People ask me if I regret what I did to my family. They ask if it's lonely at the top. Sometimes, sure, it's quiet in the big office. But then I remember the day of the funeral. I remember Marcus checking his watch while his father was being lowered into the ground. I remember the sneer in Julian's voice when he offered me pennies for my birthright. They didn't act like family. They acted like opponents. And in the game of life, you cannot afford to be sentimental about an opponent who is trying to wipe you off the board. I still compete. In fact, I have a tournament in Moscow next month. My opponents there are fierce. They study my games. They look for weaknesses in my defense. They are worthy adversaries. My uncles were not worthy adversaries. They were arrogant amateurs who thought the game was won before it started. There is a concept in chess called hubris. It's not a technical term, but every player knows it. It's the moment you stop respecting your opponent. It's the moment you think you are untouchable. That is when you are most vulnerable. My uncles had hubris. I had discipline. I remember walking through the old mill property shortly after the deal closed. It was sunset. The rusted steel beams of the old factory cast long shadows against the orange sky. I walked to the spot where the geological survey had identified the primary lithium vein. I knelt down and touched the dirt. I whispered, "We did it, Grandpa." I think he would have been proud. Not just that I won, but how I won. I didn't steal, I didn't lie. I used their own contracts, their own greed, and their own assumptions against them. I played by the rules. I just knew the rules better than they did. So to anyone out there who feels underestimated, to anyone who is the black sheep or the dropout or the weird one, let them talk. Let them think they have you figured out. Let them think you are weak. Build your fortress in silence. Sharpen your weapons in the dark. Study the board. And when the time is right, when they have overextended themselves, when they are drunk on their own arrogance, strike. And don't just check them, checkmate them. Because the look on their faces, it's worth more than billions. This is Natalie Edwards, Grandmaster, CEO, and the woman who checkmated her own family. Thanks for listening.